Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Leanne, and I am with the People's Forum. The People's Forum is a center for political education and revolutionary culture. We are based in New York City, but we learn from and we look towards the struggles of people's movements and working class organizations in struggle across the country and across the world. And so we're really very excited to be co-hosting this conversation organized by the Qiao Collective. And thank you all for joining us this evening. There's really just no better time for us to be developing a clear understanding on US militarization of Asia and the Pacific, which we know has been an ongoing process over many years and with bipartisan support. And we've recently been in a period of escalated aggression on China in particular, which has a lot to do with something we've been following pretty closely at the People's Forum. The many dramatic failures throughout this pandemic of the US and imperialist agenda to care for and provide for human life. And instead of using its wealth of resources to reorganize society, to put human life at the center and to address the massive loss of life, of jobs, of livelihoods, inside and outside US borders, it's just been attacking and escalating attacks against those states that are providing some sort of or proposing or building towards an alternative organization of society. So with this in mind, I've really appreciated over the past month the many resources that the Qiao Collective has been developing and sharing publicly to help us see through the ruling class narrative on China. Part of that imperialist narrative is that there's a conflict between the US and China that are two equal players, which I'm sure the panel will go more into this. But we know that that's a distortion. It's a distortion of reality. And in fact, the US attacks on China and militarization of the region affects the entire region, not just China, the entire region and the entire world. So we're really grateful for an opportunity to continue developing an analysis that cuts through that false narrative. And really, we're very eager to hear the perspectives of this amazing panel. So I would like to pass it off to Kevin with many thanks. Kevin from the Qiao Collective, thank you so much for being here and moderating and for organizing this talk. Thank you all, and over to you.
Thank you for the really excellent introduction, and thank you to the audience for joining our panel, From Hybrid to Hot War, US Militarization in Asia and the Pacific Under the New Cold War on China. This panel is hosted by the Qiao Collective and the People's Forum, featuring panelists Christine Hong, Michael Lujan Vlaqua, and Mark Tseng Putterman. The panel will be divided into two parts. So first, the speakers will each give a short talk followed by a Q&A section. For viewers on Zoom, please send in your questions via the Q&A function. For viewers on YouTube and Facebook streams, please send in your questions as comments on the streams. And we'll be gathering the questions as they're sent in. So just to introduce myself, I'm a member of the Qiao Collective, a media collective of Chinese people, both diaspora living in the West and non-diaspora in China, who are focused on challenging US aggression on China and promoting anti-imperialist internationalism. You can read more about us on our website at www.qiaocollective.com. That's QIAO collective.com. We are a group of writers, artists, and researchers who have taken on the task of mounting a challenge to escalating US imperialism on China. And we're very excited because today's panel will focus on US militarization of Asia and the Pacific under the auspices of the renewed US containment doctrine and the new Cold War on China. And over the past several years, we have seen a massive and alarming reconfiguration of the US military apparatus to target China as the enemy nation du jour. From Obama's pivot to Asia, to Trump's Cold War rhetoric, to Biden's labeling China as our greatest enemy, the US war apparatus has zeroed in on China as the strawman enemy nation and is deploying false claims of a China threat narrative to justify the further entrenchment of its own militarization of regions in Asia and the Pacific. We have also seen a failure on the part of leftist spaces within the Western sphere to challenge this reconfiguring of US imperialism to target China. Therefore, it is of vital importance to address how the US targeting of China is being deployed as a rhetorical tool to justify militarization of regions in Asia and the Pacific. The same US warplanes that are doing freedom of navigation flights into China's airspace are taking off from military bases in Hawaii and Guam. In 2020, the US Indo-Pacific Command released a report titled Regain the Advantage, requesting an additional $20 billion in funding. The primary justification for this massive increase in funding is challenging China. The report calls for terrifying new levels of militarization in Asia and the Pacific, including the creation of air and land military attack systems, precision strike networks amongst islands in the Pacific, and increased production of planes and warships to conduct freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. In fact, Guam was featured as a central core of the budget proposal, which requests $1.6 billion to build a defensive ring around Guam. This is yet another example of how the false narrative of the China threat and renewed US Cold War aggression on China is justifying and entrenching the US militarization and occupation of regions in Asia and the Pacific, such as Okinawa, Korea, Hawaii, Guam, and beyond. In addition, we reject the false equivalence of the US and China as equal instigators of this massive ramping up of US military aggression in Asia and the Pacific. And we believe that the US is instigating military aggression on China. China is not the instigator, it is the US. It is the US that is unilaterally driving the deadly buildup of military apparatuses in Asia and the Pacific, from deployments of weapons, to warships, to planes, to bases. It is crucial not just for the fate of Chinese people, but for all peoples in the Asia and Pacific region to unequivocally challenge this. In order to do so, this panel hopes to build connections between national anti-imperialist and anti-colonial struggles in Korea, Guam, and China, and centers an interregional approach to resist the impacts of a US-led new Cold War. In order to disarm the US empire's framing of the Asia-Pacific as a strategic terra nullius for US military and economic supremacy, we highlight the people's struggles under the rubrics of internationalism and anti-imperialism to pose an alternative vision for Asia and Pacific futures. The US is on a relentless warpath, and it is up to us to stop it. As such, we hope this panel conversation can help build connections and forward an analysis of the interregional impacts of the new Cold War and to connect the dots between US aggression on China and the various sites of anti-imperialist struggle in Asia and the Pacific. Ultimately, we believe that the internationalist solidarity is based on anti-imperialism, demilitarization, and decolonization, and that is the best path towards effective resistance in the US imperial apparatus. And now, we will transition to our individual panelists who will each be giving a talk. Our first panelist to speak is Professor Christine Hong. Christine Hong is a professor at UC Santa Cruz in the Literature Department and in Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, specializing in transnational Asian American, Korean diaspora, US War and Empire, and comparative ethnic studies. Hong is the author of A Violent Peace, which offers a radical account of the United States' transformation into a total war state as the Cold War turned hot in the Pacific. Now, Christine.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks to the Qiao Collective and the People's Forum for organizing and hosting today's conversation. I'm just going to share my screen. So in our current moment, it makes sense to return to what what Barack Obama viewed as his signature foreign policy, his pivot to Asia and Pacific and the Pacific, a rebalancing of US naval forces to 60% in contrast to 40% in the Atlantic. At the heart of this militarized agenda for what Obama's Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called America's Pacific Century was a critical bait and switch, namely the specter of a nuclear-armed, volatile North Korea as a facilitator for US hegemonic designs within the greater region. So I just wanted to begin with this just to show you that in South Korea, on July 27th, which is the day that the Korean War Armistice Agreement was signed, which did not eventuate in a peace treaty, Koreans routinely gathered together to call for peace. So I wanted to speak about something that Kang Jung-gu, who is a scholar activist who's with the organization Solidarity for Peace and Reunification in Korea, or SPARC. He stated something in an interview that I did with him almost a decade ago. This is in 2012. And he stated that the divided Korean peninsula serves a very critical geostrategic function. And what he says is, to reverse its loss of power, the United States has targeted global weak points, the divided Korean peninsula and the Middle East. From the perspective of US foreign policy, conflict in the divided Korean peninsula offers an opportunity for staging a power transition within the arena of global politics. From the perspective of US strategic interests in the region, Korea can serve as a facilitator or a delayer, a weakener or strengthener. Okay, so the opportunistic, the sort of opportunistic designs of the United States on the Korean Peninsula is predicated upon the peninsula's division. And we should think here about the fact that the ongoing division of the peninsula corresponds to a US foreign policy that refuses recognition, any formal recognition of North Korea. North Korea is instead understood as a rogue state. And we can also see that post 9/11, our more immediate historical moment, the United States intensified its demonization of North Korea. And this is a sort of historical period in which the axis of the very elastic rubric of the axis of evil was stretched to cover and continue unfinished US anti-communist counterinsurgencies. And so the geopolitical structure within the region that persists into the present is predicated fundamentally on the irresolution of the Korean War. And so this is what Kang Jung-gu has stated. And I want to say also with regard to the post 9/11 period, we could see a passing of the baton from George W. Bush's eclipse policy toward North Korea to Obama's policy of strategic patience. And Obama's policy of strategic patience, far from a do nothing, wait and see policy, was profoundly offensive. It was a policy under which Asia and the Pacific was subjected to fortified militarization on a vast scale. So the very region in which the Cold War turned mercilessly hot and millions of people died was subjected in the post 9/11 moment to fortified militarization. The strategic logic of Obama's pivot policy was without question the containment of China, but the threat but this threat was displaced to no small degree on a post 9/11 boogeyman, North Korea. And so even though, of course, there's overt anti-China rhetoric, we also have to understand the geostrategic value of North Korea as a straw man for US designs within the larger region. And so Kang Jung-gu, in the interview that I did with him a number of years ago, spoke about the necessity of Cold War sub-imperial collusion in the post 9/11 era, and how basically we see this kind of reanimation of a Cold War anti-communist infrastructure. And what he stated was that basically the way that the United States was trying to preserve its hegemony was by relying on the resources of allied or sub-imperial countries, and he spoke as about the Libyan war as a kind of parallel. And what he stated was, because of its own economic problems, the United States wants Korea, Japan, Australia, and India to encircle China with their money, not US money. And it's totally possible through a number of mutual defense treaties and strategic agreements that the United States has brokered throughout the greater region. And so I wanted to just, say that I asked Kang Jung-gu the question, would you describe this, and this is about a decade ago, as a neo-Cold War policy toward China? He was unequivocal. He simply said yes. And so I just wanted to turn to a 2012 film called Red Dawn, and this was MGM's 2012 reboot of a 1984 Cold War original. And I just wanted to demonstrate how Hollywood illustrates this kind of bait and switch logic. In this rebooted version, originally, the filmmakers had China or Chinese, forces invading the United States, and in a last-minute swap, had North Korean invaders farcically attempting to perpetrate regime change on US soil, only to be outdone by a pack of suburban American teenagers who call themselves the Wolverines. And so, ripped from the script of Red Dawn 2, the bait and switch narrative at the heart of the Obama era pivot policy required North Korea to fulfill a necessary devil function for the region as a whole. It's worth recalling that MGM, facing a ton of criticism from media in China, not coincidentally the second largest movie market in the world, announced that it had decided at the 11th hour to replace the film's Chinese bad guys with North Korean villains. So North Korea was basically pasted in as China's proxy with few financial consequences. Digitally altering PRC flags, military insignia, and propaganda posters to appear North Korean would cost the studio well over $1 million in the post-production phase. So I just want to point out how North Korea has served as a lucrative fantasy, not just for Hollywood, but for the national security establishment and the military industrial complex. North Korea, so to speak, has been the fantasy around which the proliferation of the US war machine in Asia and the Pacific has been possible. So not merely the stuff of Hollywood fantasies. North Korea, inflated as an existential menace in the long post 9/11 era, has been indispensable to the deployment of ballistic missile defenses closer to North Korea, not to mention sales of surveillance drone technology to regional allies. Indeed, central to the staging of US forward deployed missile defense systems, Aegis, Patriot, and THAAD, this is the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, in and off the coast of Hawaii, Guam, Taiwan, Japan, Okinawa, and South Korea, including eventually on Jeju Island, has been the purported dangers posed by an armed, dangerous, and totally unpredictable North Korea to both the western coast of the United States and regional allies in the Pacific. So I wanted to show you, this is actually a dated photo somewhat, but it was from a prior Lockheed Martin product page for THAAD, and just to show you how it resembles the Red Dawn 2. So during the Obama years, the portrait of an unhinged, trigger-happy North Korea justified the acceleration of the THAAD missile defense system in Guam, a second US missile defense radar deployed near Kyoto, Japan, the positioning of nuclear aircraft carriers throughout the Pacific, and the lucrative sales of military weapons systems to US client states throughout the greater region. Albeit all key elements in US first strike attack planning, this amplified militarization of the quote-unquote American lake was justified by the Pentagon as a precautionary move to strengthen our regional defense posture against the North Korean regional ballistic missile threat. As early as June 2009, then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, in announcing the deployment of both the THAAD and sea-based radar systems to Hawaii, explained, "I think we are in a good position should it become necessary to protect American territory from a North Korean threat." In early April 2013, in a press release announcing its missile defense deployment throughout the Asia Pacific region, the Pentagon stated, The United States remains vigilant in the face of North Korean provocations and stands ready to defend US territory, our allies, and our national interests. And so you can see here that this purported threat of North Korean nukes is supposedly countered by these THAAD batteries in the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, even though scientists have actually, they've stated that logistically this doesn't even work. Okay, so it advertised as safeguarding the region against the North Korean threat. The Xband radar system, which the United States sold to Japan, is, according to the United States, quote, not directed at China, end quote, but simply a defensive measure undertaken in response to the danger posed by Pyongyang. And so you should know that the Xband radar surveillance is critical to terminal phase fire support for THAAD. And you can see here that Japan, Guam, and Korea all are central to this encircling of China. And so I think that we should think about that term that Walden Bellow has used before about a People's Pacific and the destabilizing effects of this aggressive forward deployment, and to recognize the many people's struggles against what activists understand all too well are US imperial designs on the region. So this is what Kang Jong-gu stated. He stated that the naval base at Kangjong is not against North Korea. If the strategic purpose of the base were truly to check North Korea, the naval base should have been located near North Korea. But Jeju is the southernmost island off the southernmost tip of South Korea. There's no other reason for this base other than to surround and encircle China. The Korean people know that this isn't for the South Korean Navy, it's for the US Navy. Look at Pyeongtaek. Pyeongtaek is the nearest US military installation to Beijing and Shanghai. It's only 1 or 2 hours away by civilian airplane. Firing a missile would take no time at all. So the US military installations that are the closest to China are these bases, which the United States wishes to be built at Korean expense. The same holds true of Japan, Australia, Singapore, and India. And so here you can see just people who have, in South Korea, who have routinely protested against the THAAD deployment, and it was undemocratically installed against their dissent. So I wanted to quote from Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and what he stated in a 2016 interview with Reuters was that the coverage of the THAAD missile defense system, especially the monitoring range of its Xband radar, goes beyond any defensive needs of the Korean Peninsula. It reaches deep into the Asian hinterland, penetrating into China. It damages Chinese strategic interests. It harms the security interests of other countries in the region. And he offers these two sayings, two old Chinese sayings that basically illustrate what he's getting at. So basically, like Jiang Zhuang performed a dance as a cover for his attempt on Liu Bang's life. What is the US's hidden intent? And he says, it doesn't require experts. Ordinary people, and certainly the Korean people can see this clearly. And so what he says is the villainous design is apparent. China's stance is clear enough that we firmly oppose any country's attempt to infringe China's legitimate rights and interests with the excuse of the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. And so I wanted to speak just briefly about the ongoing Korean War. And, you know, within social scientific sort of circles in the United States, there have been conversations and debates about, was this a civil war? Was it an international conflict? Was it truly a war, or was it merely a police action? And I think that the term police action is actually far more revelatory than people have given it credit for. But rarely in Western scholarship is the Korean War framed as both an imperialist war of aggression, which rained down ruin from above, and a revolutionary people's war. And so when we think about it as a revolutionary people's war, we have to think not only of China's role in the Korean theater, but also North Korea's role in China's 1949 communist revolution. And so I wanted to just say something about this war. An estimated 4 million Koreans were killed. The majority of them were civilians. The death toll numbers for the Chinese range from 400 to 900,000. 1 in 3 Korean families were separated by the permanent hardening of the 38th parallel. And according to Bruce Cummings, the University of Chicago historian, the United States perpetrated a bombing holocaust, destroying civilian infrastructures. The damage was so severe that international observers said that there was nothing left to bomb a mere 1 year into the fighting. And I wanted to also say that according to the terms of the 1953 Korean War Armistice Agreement, there was a very strong recommendation that all of the major parties to the Korean War should return to the peace table within 3 months' time to hammer out a permanent peace agreement. China exited North Korea almost immediately. By contrast, the United States militarily occupies South Korea to this day. There are roughly 80 military installations, including bases in South Korea. The United States maintains the capacity to use any South Korean base or port at whim and at will. It's on the Korean Peninsula that the United States performs the largest war exercises in the world that rehearse regime change operational plans, including the decapitation of North Korea's leadership, as well as a nuclear first strike on the Korean Peninsula, which collateralizes, by the way, the South Korean people, because you do a nuclear strike on North Korea, you are going to kill countless millions of people in Seoul. And the United States also maintains command control over the South Korean military during times of war. And so I wanted to just go to something, just the title of Iqbal Ahmed's work, Terrorism, Theirs and Ours. And he basically, looks at how the United States has used these terms in very opportunistic ways, terrorist versus freedom fighter. And he says that the terrorist of yesterday is the hero of today and vice versa. So he says, basically, we have to keep our heads straight so that we really know what truly is terrorism and what isn't. So I wanted to suggest, by extension, that the United States has a way of projecting its own characteristics to its designated enemies. And so I wanted to think about the question of militarism, theirs and ours, and to think about the Manikin geopolitical imaginary of US policy toward North Korea, which can be summed up pretty much as tyranny there, freedom here. But we can go even further. WMDs, nuclear proliferation, over-the-top defense spending, there, not here. Domestic surveillance, political imprisonment, militarized borders, religious intolerance, hunger, there, not here. And so this is a kind of imperialist cognitive mapping of the world that is geared toward regime change, a supersession by whatever means of the vile there with a kinder, gentler neoliberal here. And so there's a necessity, I would say, too, just given the account that I gave you of the Korean War, of disowning the Korean War, even though the Korean War was what cemented the military industrial complex in this country. It is what gave rise to the Cold War national security establishment, which was the largest reorganization of the federal government up to that point. It also it animated an expansion of what Chalmers Johnson called the US empire of bases within Asia and the Pacific. And so despite the centrality of the Korean War to US hegemony on the global stage, it is routinely and profoundly disavowed in a US context. And so we have to recall the profound violence of the Cold War in Asia and the Pacific, which some Cold War historians have breezily described as a long peace. So engineered out of the spoils of World War II in the Pacific theater, US military empire in Asia and the Pacific, it meant the suspension of decolonizing justice. It meant the deaths of upwards of several million civilians, the displacement of many million more, nuclear ruin that eclipsed the magnitude of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the creation of a forward deployed permanent garrison state that's hosted in sites throughout the region. This militarized regime institutionalized the sweep and grip of US power within the former Pacific theater of World War II in the form of the Pacific Command, which is now known as the Indo-Pacific Command. Compassing over half the Earth and 70% of the world's oceans, this sprawling military empire just extends latitudinally from the Arctic to Antarctica, longitudinally from the Western United States to India's west coast. Meant to keep, quote, unquote, the regional peace, it stands truly as a testament to a legacy of ongoing, under-recognized war. During the Cold War, US wars against China, North Korea, and North Vietnam demonstrate the counter-revolutionary function of the US garrison state, with regional US bases serving as a dagger that aimed at the underbelly of its socialist neighbors. So I want to just close by speaking, sorry about this. Oh, let me see, this is strange. Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened to some of my slides. I want to speak about Julian, let me just go to this, Agwan, who's a Chamorro lawyer and sovereignty activist. And I had this image of the China Marines that have been deployed to Guam, but I am not able to show it. So what happened was, this is what Julian Agwan stated in 2006. He said, last month, US Department of Defense Undersecretary Richard Lawless paid Guam politicians a visit, but shared no specifics about how the transfer of more than 8,000 Marines and their dependents from Okinawa to Guam will impact our island. To date, defense officials state nothing definite except that Guam is to be a faster response hub to the loose and alleged threats that are China and North Korea. And so what he states is he speaks about the nuclear Pacific and the fact that in the immediate wake of World War II, the United States conducted horrifying nuclear experiments, including human radiation experiments in Micronesia, and that there have been reports that document how Guam was affected by the US bombing of the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958. This is a period of 12 years in which the United States, in its bombings, basically perpetrated the equivalent of 1.7 Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's per day. And so that even though the Marshall Islands are 1,200 miles east of Guam, Guam received nuclear fallout from more than 10 of the bombings. US military vehicles that actually conducted radioactivity measurements were flown to Guam. They're fleshed out there. Local harbors and lagoons have yet to be cleaned. This is what he was stating back in 2006. And he says that the Guam EPA issued a public warning to refrain from eating fish in that area due to the dangerous levels of cancer-causing dioxins. Even now, 4 Marshallese babies are born without eyeballs, and this is all testament to US nuclear violence. And he states, the deadly dust fell on a people, the Chamorro people, the Marshallese people, who could have taken at least some precautionary measures. Only last month, another defense official informed us of how the United States kept about 5,000 drums of Agent Purple in Guam in an undisclosed area in 1952 in anticipation of use on the Korean Peninsula. But the bans play on, and we are expected to believe that the danger is China and North Korea, end quote. And so he states, solidarity is not our best bet, it's our only one. And I just wanted to turn to a teaching initiative that I am part of. And this comes from a resolution that some of us were part of an Ending the Korean War collective. We pulled together this resolution and it was passed unanimously by the Association for Asian American Studies. And I just want to close by reading this. Whereas US military empire in Asia and the Pacific exploits the pretext of a menacing North Korea and the sub-imperial complicity of regional client states, as in the South Korean deployment of over 300,000 soldiers to fight alongside US forces in the US war in Vietnam, and in the strategic incorporation of sites like Diego Garcia, Guam, the Marshall Islands, Hawaii, and Okinawa into its forward deployed posture against North Korea, whereas the Korean War as a structure of permanent war exacts an imperial toll, justifying monstrous trillion-dollar defense budgets. In 2015, 54% of the federal discretionary budget, enabling the United States to wage endless wars and maintain troops abroad, the contamination, resource exploitation, and seizure of indigenous lands, and the militarization of poor non-white peoples within its army, correlating to unemployment, austerity programs that deny access to decent education, healthcare, and housing, and the militarization of the police. Whereas the Korean War, the longest running US conflict, enabled the United States to consolidate its global military imperial dominance, inaugurating the US military industrial complex and justifying its base expansion while continually justifying US power projection in the region, its encirclement of China, and the ever expanding US military budget. And the resolution closes with calling for a resolution for peace in detailed fashion, including the launching of a broad-based political education program aimed at a decolonizing approach to the Korean War. So I just wanted to end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was really a fantastic presentation and really learned a lot. Again, thank you very much. Next, we will have Michael Lujan Bavacqua, who is a co-chair for Independent Guahan, an organization dedicated to educating the Guam community about the need to decolonize and seek a new political status as an independent nation. He has testified multiple times at the United Nations as an expert on Guam's decolonization and is a member of Guam's Commission on Decolonization. The floor is yours, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everyone watching and listening. All right. So first, let me introduce you to a place called Letexan, or commonly called Retidian in English. This is a ecological and cultural treasure that exists on the northwestern coast of Guam. It's a beautiful place. There's cultural artifacts dating to more than 3,000 years that can be found there. There's the remnants of a village that was there prior to Spanish colonization. The Texan is a beautiful place that holds so much significance to so many different people. It's also a place which is at the center of community protest and around Guam's political status and about Guam's role in the United States for its military purposes. And so Litegzen is a place where there are original landowners that have been displaced for military purposes. There are landowners who would like their land back. There are those who want to protect the cultural sites there, the human remains there. But the US military for the past few years has been building a firing range complex and a US Marine Corps barracks and a huge new base in this area. And so in 2019, public outcry over this reached a certain peak. And in June 25th of 2019, a collection of more than 30 different community groups gathered to meet the Magahaga, or the elected governor of the island, Lulian Guerrero. And so in the government complex in Adelup, more than 100 people gathered and met to express their frustration about this military construction, which the year before had been revealed that human remains and cultural artifacts had been found at one construction site, and that the military had done some shallow collections, putting bones and human remains in just plastic bags and then bulldozed the area. And so people were upset about the loss of access to this beautiful place, which some consider to be sacred to the Chamorro people. And so at this meeting, more than 100 members of the community representing more than 30 groups expressed their frustration to the elected leader of the island, Lulian Guerrero. Now, let's introduce you to Guam a little bit first. Guam is the tip of America's spear, as different sort of military commanders have referred to it over the years. This is an image from the first Valiant Shield exercise about 15 years ago. And Guam is an interesting place, a little over 200 square miles, but one of the most militarized places in the world. Every 2 years, one of the largest peacetime exercises in the world happens, organized by the United States, oftentimes involving multiple other allied nations, sometimes featuring hundreds of airplanes, tens of thousands of troops, dozens of ships. But these huge war games take place regularly off the coast of Guam and in the Marianas Islands. And so when I said that Guam was one of the most militarized places in the world, it definitely shows. Here is a map of the island, and 27% of Guam is US military facilities. And as you can see on the map, the green in the north is Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Communications. And then you have Army bases, THAAD missiles, you have in the south, Naval Magazine, and then you also have Navy Base Guam. And so if you imagine a beautiful island in the Western Pacific, right on the edge of Asia, but everywhere you go in the north and the south, you can see lines of military fences. And every day as you look up to the sky, you can usually see military helicopters or military planes flying overhead. And so one of the names that Guam and the Marianas have received recently is the playground, the military's playground, because Guam is at the middle of the Marianas Island Testing and Training Range, which is the largest US military training area in the world, over almost 1 million square miles. And that the US military feels that they have a lot of freedom to move, to act, to test, and to train, freedom that they don't have in a lot of other places. But let's talk about what Guam is politically. Guam, first and foremost, is the homeland of the indigenous people, the Chamorros. But in a political context, people on Guam, Chamorros and non-Chamorros, do not get to vote for the US president. There are no electoral college votes for Guam. There is no voting representation in the US Congress either. Despite this lack of democratic participation, all federal laws apply to Guam. Guam is also barred from participating in regional and international bodies. And so colonization isolates Guam. Guam as a territory, a colony of the United States, isolates it, even though it is on the edge of Asia, closely connected, close by all of these emerging Pacific nations, emerging Asian nations, established Asian nations. Guam is barred from interacting directly or formally working with any of those countries because of its status as a territory. At that meeting in June of 2019, when confronted with the public outcry over this base construction, and one of the main demands was that the Magahagan Guahan, the governor of Guam, demand that the military pause their construction of their bases until sufficient time had been done to do environmental studies and to make sure that any cultural artifacts were protected. She gave two responses as to why, as to sort of her position on the military buildup, the US military presence on the island. One of them spoke about Guam's political status. She said, if we decide our political status, whatever that may be, that's our strength and the leverage we have if we are going to go out and negotiate on our terms. Some people feel we have no voice in this whole story of militarization, in this whole military buildup. It's because I feel we do not have the political status we need to provide that strength. And so what she's referring to here is that fact that Guam, as an unincorporated territory of the United States, was designated by the United Nations as a non-self-governing territory, doesn't have any leverage, doesn't have any position in terms of what the US military does on the island. And we don't have to look for any sort of secret documents about this. Military commanders admit to this all the time. This is a former head of US PATCOM, William Fallon. And so in 2006, he gave an interview in which he talked about why Guam was important, what made Guam strategically valuable to the United States. And the first answer that he gave is just look at a map. Number one, location. Guam is on the edge of Asia. And in 2006, somebody trying to highlight this out of the Joint Guam Program Office, which was supposed to oversee military buildup construction operations in Guam, they reminded the media that it would take a ship from San Diego traveling at 16 knots, 16 days to get to Taiwan from Hawaii, to get to Taiwan from Hawaii, 12 days, but from Guam only 4 days. It would take a C-17 aircraft 13 hours to fly from the west coast to Taiwan from Hawaii, almost 8 hours, but from Guam, 3 hours and 20 minutes. And so one reason that Guam is valuable, of course, as everyone can see, is it's closer to the quote unquote potential hotspots, the dangers in Asia, the places where the US might need to intervene. But if you pay attention to interviews with military commanders and strategic planners, there's actually always something else just on the edge of their discourse, which highlights that the political ambiguity of Guam is also very valuable. As Fallon acknowledged in that same interview, Guam is American territory, and it does not have the political restrictions, such as those in South Korea, that could impede US military moves in an emergency. And that's something that's key. Military commanders sometimes feel that in foreign countries, like in Japan or in South Korea, that they have to constantly ask permission or deal with the State Department or foreign governments in order to do anything. But in Guam, there is this freedom of action because there is no SOFA, there is no treaty, there is no sovereign government which can interfere with whatever the US has planned for the island. In 1993, in the book Pacific Passages, a Swedish anthropologist quoted a US Air Force captain as highlighting it in this way. He said that people on Guam seem to forget that they are a possession and not an equal partner. If California says they want to do this, it is like my wife saying she wants to move here or there. I'll have to respect her wish and at least discuss it with her. If Guam says they want to do this or that, it is as if this cup here expresses a wish. The answer will be, you belong to me and I can do with you as I please. And so this is also part of that value of Guam to the United States, is that ability to move forces there, take forces out, to train, to build up, but not having to ask for permission. And that's where the tip of the spear metaphor, of course, is very, very important in understanding Guam's position. You don't have to ask your spear to go to war. You don't have to get permission from your spear to use it. But Lulian Guerrero mentioned another issue in the community's discussion about the buildup. And she said that she supported the military increases to Guam. She said that she supported the new base, the use of the Texan for a firing range, because she said, I support it for national security reasons. When I go to these military briefings that they give to me as governor, I can see the fact of possible outside invasion to us. And why is that? Because we are in a geographic position where the military, the US, sees us as a place where the first line of defense. And you might say, why are you buying into it? Because I feel that it is a threat to us. And so regularly, the idea of China and North Korea as threats to Guam constantly appear in the local media. Oftentimes completely just reprinting press releases from the Pentagon or from the local from the local military bases. And so there is constantly always this feeling that we are in danger of being invaded by China. We are in danger of being invaded by North Korea. And it's very interesting because of course it serves the interests of the United States. As the previous speaker mentioned, it justifies military presence, it justifies military spending. And so this is very much the case in Guam, where even the governor of the island, confronted with the community outrage over this military base and how we're not being respected as they are building this base, feels that the briefings she gets from the military in which they say Chinese bombs here, North Korean missiles there, that's strong enough to make her feel like she's helpless. She has to go along with it because of these threats to the island. And part of understanding why these threats have power in Guam, you just have to look at history. When Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941, Guam was bombed by the Japanese just a few hours after that. And that started a period of 32 months of terrible atrocities committed against the Chamorro people by the Japanese. Forced labor, rapes, and then in the closing weeks of the war, there was a number of massacres of Chamorro people by the Japanese. And so that is very strong in the memories of those who experienced it, the family, their children and their grandchildren after that. And it's a very strong part of the public memory on Guam, being occupied by the Japanese. And so when these threats are announced from China or from North Korea, as you can see on the right there, that is the biggest local newspaper, the Pacific Daily News, in 2017, when there was the missile threats from North Korea and the war of words of fire and fury between Trump and Kim Jong-un, that when the threat is invoked in a contemporary sense, people feel it through that history of occupation by the Japanese. And people resist and people get afraid about stepping outside of the United States or going against the United States' wishes for Guam because of that fear that we might be invaded again, we might get attacked again. And this basically puts Guam in this type of position. This is a drawing done by my brother for me, which shows my two kids living at the tip of the sphere. That if Guam is the tip of the sphere, surrounded by all of these powers around them, what kind of life is that? What kind of future can there be for those who live at the tip of the sphere? The tip of the sphere is, after all, the first thing to get bloody. And so it does make you wonder what kind of future awaits Guam, if we accept this status as being the tip of America's sphere, right? Because as was shown when Donald Trump was, or as was shown in the last North Korean threat period, when Donald Trump and US military commanders said that they would defend America from North Korea, people on Guam were confused. Did that mean that they were also going to defend Guam if there was an attack? Or did they mean that they were going to use Guam to defend America from North Korea? Because those are two very different equations. And Guam has the history to prove that those are two very different equations. And so this is something that has entered the island media discourse, the idea of Guam killers, missiles from China that have the ability to reach Guam. And so this is a whole new phase of the threat discourse about China towards Guam, because at first it was this amorphous communist Asian threat, But then eventually the media puts out this idea that there are these missiles designed specifically to reach Guam, and therefore there's a whole new level to this threat. But one of the things that's always interesting about this discussion about America keeping Guam safe from these threats is that question of whether the bases on the island increase our risk, make us insecure, or make us more secure. And so this is a meme that was created a few years ago when the Guam killers were announced, because there was so much of this discourse around about China as this aggressive power, that it could hit Guam, it could hurt Guam, and that we needed to sort of cling close to America to stay safe. And part of it was also that if we weren't under America, then China would invade us and bomb us. But some people asked a very simple question. If China is this menacing threat that is out to get Guam, why isn't it out to get all the other islands in the Pacific? So why is it that there's no threat discourse against Samoa, the Cook Islands, Fiji, Nauru, Palau? Why is it that there's no conversation in any of the other islands in which China is aiming missiles at them? And so the simple question is, does having US military bases, does it make us safe, or does it make us a target? Does it put us on the radar in ways that we don't want to be? And so these are important questions that come out from that. Do the bases make us safer, or do they increase risk to the island? But one of the most fascinating things that has come out of this, though, is the fact that Guam is on the edge of Asia. Guam is, in so many ways, different than the United States. It has different connections to places in Asia. It has different interests. It lives a different reality, even as the American influence tries to dictate what Guam is and what it can be. But one of the things that we found very recently is this strange ambivalence from local leaders and local business leaders and political leaders, where what would happen over several years was this sort of contradictory lobbying and contradictory discourse about what China was. So for example, the local Chamber of Commerce would go to Washington, DC to lobby the federal government. And they would go and they would visit Homeland Security, and they would talk about how Chinese tourists are not a risk, that they need a visa waiver for Guam so that more Chinese can come and visit the island to boost the economy. China's such a big tourist market, and China's not a threat. And that, can we please get an exception to US immigration restrictions so that it's easier for mainland Chinese to come to Guam so that they can boost our economy. And then the next day they would go to the Pentagon, where they would meet with members of Congress, and they would talk about how China's the biggest threat in the entire world right now, and we need more missiles, and we need more bases. We need more American troops to protect us. And so this is part of the ways in which Guam is sort of living out the contradictory nature of US foreign policy itself, is that on Guam, we don't get to sort of decide what our relationship is to anybody around us. And so in a sense, we're stuck with this contradictory relationship where China is both an important potential economic ally, but also the greatest threat that we have ever known, and we have to do everything to protect ourselves from. A lot of this has then led, so a lot of these issues, especially the North Korea threats, but also sort of these military increases in response to China and so on, has led to a new wave of activism around these sorts of issues. Because, and this is from 2017, when after sort of there was that time of the threat discourse between US and North Korea, Independent Guam, a group that I'm part of, but also political leaders from Guam, led a delegation to go to the United Nations to try to talk to the world about what was going on. Because the media around the world was framing it in such a, framing sort of North Korea, the United States, in such ways that Guam was being lost. The voices of the people of Guam were being lost very easily in that. And so we decided at our own expense through fundraising to try to go out to New York to try to talk to the world, to sort of let them know that, you know, we have our own interests, we have our own dreams and our own hopes, and that we want something more than to just be the tip of America's spear. That we are more than just that. And this has continued to grow. In June of 2019, there was the meeting with the governor of Guam, but then in response to the military's refusal to pause their construction, but also feelings amongst people about the need to be something more than just a territory. In September of 2019, Guam had the largest political demonstration that it's ever had. The Whanaogi March for Chamorro Self-Determination, which more than 2,000 people participated in, Chamorros and non-Chamorros, but a statement about the need for the United States to recognize the rights of the Chamorro people and the broad support within the community to get out of this status of being a possession of the United States. And so what's fascinating is that the threat discourse from China about China and North Korea is meant to box Guam in and to keep Guam in the same place. So where people feel afraid to decolonize, afraid to step out of line, afraid to ask for more than just to be strategically valuable to the United States. But what it's actually done because of the US's refusals to hear the people of Guam and to take seriously their issues, their demands for justice, it's actually led to a broader movement and desire for change, for political status change. And so even though so for me personally, what I hope is that I really, really hope that sort of this status of being America's spear tip, America's weapon, that through decolonization and through bridging, developing relationships from Asia, across Asia, in the Pacific to the West, that we can be a bridge between worlds rather than a weapon pointed from one end of the world to the other. And so, Sidusmasi, thank you for listening to my presentation. And so if you are interested in any of the issues that I've discussed, you can follow on social media Independent Wahan, or you can follow Patehi Lategzan, which is a group dedicated to trying to protest about the military buildups that are happening on the island right now. There is also the Fanatsu podcast, which is a decolonization-based podcast in Guam. And so, Sidusmasi, thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Michael, for what was really a very riveting and very, I would say, very sobering talk. Next, we will have Mark speak. So Mark Ten Putterman is a writer and PhD candidate in American Studies at Brown University. His work focuses on Asian American political formation, internationalism, and the politics of network media under the US Cold War empire. So it's all yours, Mark.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone at the Qiao Collective and the People's Forum for the invitation and for making this conversation possible. It's really a pleasure to be here and also follow such incredible talks from my fellow panelists. This talk is going to take a slightly different angle into this question of US militarization in Asia Pacific. And I want to try to take a long-term historical view, really of the idea of China in the American imperial imagination. And stress this framing of the idea of China out of the recognition of the fact that US orientations towards China for many centuries actually has been guided not by recognition of Chinese people as agents of history, but rather as objects of Western fantasies of dominance. And so I'll ask what we can gain by putting contemporary US-China relations within the historical framework of US imperialism. How does putting China back into this frame strengthen our understanding of the workings of US empire? And I put forth these framing questions because I sense that amidst all of the highly charged rhetoric about the so-called rise of China, so-called great power competition between the US and China, a deep amnesia in the West when it comes to the history of American imperial ambitions in China. And I think this amnesia is really dangerous because it helps to solidify these US narratives. China and not the US is the true imperialist threat to the region. And while China is often framed in historical accounts as at the periphery or an outlier to the history of Western colonialism in Asia, I want to argue that recentering China can actually be instructive for understanding US innovations and practices of informal and free trade imperialism in the 19th and 20th centuries, and which continue to structure our present moment. And my hope is that this long view can help to situate the resurgence of China as a strategic competitor. Despite the apparent newness of the return of China to the top of the US policy agenda, the US state of permanent war in Asia and the Pacific today is in fact the inevitable product of a century-long project of American expansion in the Pacific, an expansionist project guided in no small part by lust for control of the fabled China market. And so in order to start this story, I want to rewind all the way back to the formations of the United States as a nation itself. If we look at the Boston Tea Party of 1773, Americans were often taught this is a story of brave patriots protesting British tyranny, in which revolutionary Americans dumped 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. An aspect of global capitalism which is left out is that these chests of tea were in fact Chinese tea, and that the historical watershed might be understood better as a merchant class conflict between American merchants and British merchants over the spoils of the China trade. For the British East India Company long held monopoly on the importation of tea, and the British Tea Act 1773, which sparked the Tea Party, had given the British East India Company the right to directly import and sell tea directly in North America, free of duties, essentially cutting out American middlemen merchants who purchased tea to be imported and resold in the American colonies. And so we might think about this act of independence less about, slogan of no taxation without representation, and more about the insertion of American merchants into a trade, a China trade, which was increasingly becoming reliant on the sale of opium. In this sense, the liberties sought by the American Revolution, as historians such as Gerald Horne have shown, are really the privileges of racial capitalism. The ability of American colonists to continue the slave trade and settlement of the American continent, absent of British interference or regulation, and to access the spoils of the China market, free from the shadow of British monopolies. In this context, the first American ship to sail for Guangzhou, the Empress China, which left New York's harbor in 1784, was considered a symbol for American national prowess and the promise of its commercial expansion. The destiny of American independent power was to be found in China. Presenting the young American Republic as an equal to the great European empires meant joining the coalition of powers led by Britain to quote-unquote open China to Western trade, most notoriously to the sale of opium. And despite presenting itself to the Qing court as a more benign, benevolent Western power, the US actually throughout the 19th century condoned and actively benefited from various imperialist encroachments on Chinese sovereignty. For America's own commercial destiny was similarly staked to the coerced opening of the China market. For instance, amidst the violence of the first Opium War, President John Quincy Adams described China's restrictions of the opium trade as an outrage upon the rights of human nature and upon the first principle of the rights of nations. By the Second Opium War rolled around, the US was actively aiding British and French bombardments of both Tianjin and Guangzhou, despite its formal neutrality. And for its role in prying open China's door to the sale of opium, American merchant families such as the Delanos, the Perkins, the Astors, the Forbes, and the Cabots all made a fortune in this narcotic. Importantly, the United States reaped all these benefits of West imperialist intervention without incurring the costs of full-scale war. In 1844, the US negotiated the Treaty of Wangxia, which afforded the US most favored nation status, the same entitlements British and French had been afforded, including the right for Americans to buy land in the concession ports, to tariffs on trade within the treaty ports, and the right of extraterritoriality, meaning the right for Americans living in China to be tried under the American judicial system. Entitlement which created the strange jurisdiction known as the United States Court for China, which operated until 1943. On the heels of American expansion into Hawaii, the Philippines, and Guam in the 1890s, growing US interests in the China trade necessitated a change of tactics. In 1899, as Japanese and Russian land claims in China threatened a new scramble of China, which might replace this equal access treaty port system with formal, discrete spheres of influence, US Secretary of State John Hay put forth his now famous open door note policy, which called on the European powers to keep China open to trade with all countries on an equal basis and to prevent any colonial power from seeking exclusive access to China's markets. And importantly, this was presented as a defense of Chinese sovereignty and a critique of European colonialism. But in fact, we understand that the interests and strategy behind this policy were less benevolent. This was in fact a policy of free market imperialism founded on the belief that left to an equal playing field, US manufacturing advantages would inevitably dominate the China market. As the New York Times editorial page put it in 1898, we need no more territory, but we must have more markets. And so in this sense, I think we could view US ambitions towards China in this era not as peripheral to the history of US imperialism, but really as paradigmatic of what historian William Appleman Williams has called American anti-colonial imperialism. The partial retention of Chinese territorial integrity in the 19th century is better understood not as evidence of China's escape from imperialist encroachment, but instead is reflective of a shift to so-called modern tactics of empire, which continue to guide our contemporary moment. These being the preservation of market-friendly environments for Western capital via trade wars, unequal treaties, and backed by the ultimate threat of US military intervention. And so, of course, the refinement tactics of informal imperialism in China occur alongside the expansion of formal territorial colonialism. And it's here, I think, integrating China into a regional history of US expansionism in the Pacific is particularly important. The long mythologized China market had been, for many centuries, seen as the crown jewel of American expansionist efforts. From Manifest Destiny ambitions, which framed territorial expansion into Oregon and California as so-called windows to the Orient, Pacific dominance had long been seen as the natural right of American expansionism, reducing the Pacific region and its various sovereign nations to, in the words of Douglas MacArthur, an Anglo-Saxon lake, or in the words of John F. Kennedy, America's new frontier. And so colonial expansion into the Pacific was similarly couched in ambitions of greater access to the China trade. Following the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom and its annexation as a US territory in 1898, the McKinley administration declared, quote, "We must have Hawaii to help us get our share of China." Similarly, following the Spanish-American War and the brutal US suppression of Philippines' anti-imperialist insurrection, McKinley declared his intention to render the Philippines an American Hong Kong, a launch point for US commercial and political incursions into China. And the reduction of the Philippines to a military commercial outpost of the American empire also had military ramifications for China as well. For instance, in 1900, the president dispatched 5,000 American troops from the Philippines to China in order to join the other imperialist powers in putting down the anti-Western, anti-imperialist Boxer Rebellion. So to turn to our contemporary moment, what does this history have to do with our present political context? And I would argue that the 19th century quest to open China's door to American commercial imperialism really remains the structuring metaphor for US-China relations. Within the logic of this metaphor, the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949 under the Communist Party leadership is represented as the closing of the long-desired open door. And various Cold War strategies of containment, blockade, proxy war, and ultimately content engagement have been structured by these continuous American aspirations to finally regain access to China's fabled markets. Thus, we see this language of free trade, market access, tearing down trade barriers, continuing to be deployed really as the defining register of US engagement with modern China, from the Clinton era negotiations in the 90s over China's ascension to the World Trade Organization, to the so-called trade war launched by the Trump administration. And within this imagination of free trade imperialism, China is yet again not a nation or people with its own aspirations and destiny, but as the American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing once put it, a lusted repository of 1 billion customers. And so, of course, this ongoing trade aggression against China works hand in hand with military aggression, which the previous speakers have spoken eloquently to. And I think, recognizing that trade aggression and military aggression often happen not from moments of American economic strength, but from moments of economic precarity, it's no surprise that the 2011 pivot to Asia comes on the heels of the 2008 financial crisis. And so I want to argue that this history matters because it helps to reframe US-China relations not as this so-called inter-imperial rivalry, as many American supposed leftists have kind of demurred responsibility for taking a strong anti-war, anti-militarist stance as the US parades warships through the South China Sea and whatnot. This of an inter-imperial rivalry, I argue, really falls apart when we think about contemporary US ambitions vis-a-vis China really as the continuation of a centuries-long American project of Pacific hegemony. And so I think I'll end there so that we have some more time for the Q&A, but I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Wow, yeah, this is I think I speak not just for myself, but for the rest of the audience that, all three of these talks have been really fantastic. So thank you, Christine, Mark, and Michael. And there's a lot to unpack, so I wanted to touch upon some points as we segue into the Q&A section. And just to remind our viewers, please post your questions in the comments section of your stream or the Q&A section of the Zoom. And we will be gathering your questions to pose to the panelists. So please feel free for any of the panelists to respond and engage with your co-panelist response. And I actually wanted to start with the point which you left off on, Mark, and I want to open this to the rest of our panelists as well. So a common criticism lobbied against China is the claim that it is engaged in an inter-imperial rivalry with the US. And many Westerners and those under the influence of Western political ideology claim that China's influence is now so large as to pose a threat to the political ecology of Asia. Now, how is this reduction of unilateral US aggression on China to what we call a so-called equal rivalry, in some ways reinforcing and naturalizing US militarism and imperialism against not just China, but also in Asia and Pacific? So maybe just like expand this last point with the other panelists as well.
I could potentially get us started, if that's okay. Yeah, I mean, something I wanted to touch on, and I think this question really gets at, is the way that the United States positions itself, not only as a natural, benevolent kind of protector of democracy and national sovereignty in Asia and the Pacific, but actually, positions itself as a Pacific nation itself. And this is rhetoric that goes back a long way, but has been used, recently by the Obama administration, and even more recently in, I think, a very telling document, which was just released from the Trump administration, the US Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific, starts off with the proclamation that the United States is and always has been an Indo-Pacific nation. And so I think this language of naturalizing US presence in Asia and the Pacific, really halfway across the world from the continental United States, it goes a long way in positioning the United States again as, a natural partner to its, client states and sub-imperialist states within Asia and the Pacific in a way that I think is really dangerous for, working towards a future of regional multilateralism and regional relations that are not structured and determined by the interests of US empire.
I guess I would just add, and this is in conversation with what Michael was sharing with us. Michael, it's so striking to me that you were speaking about the memories of imperial Japanese atrocities and how the kind of phobic discourses around the China threat and the North Korea threat get sort of mapped onto those kinds of recollections. And because I was just thinking about the fact that peoples across Asia and the Pacific have memories of imperial Japanese atrocities, and that includes people in China, it includes people in Korea. And those memories of those atrocities, when I was speaking about the suspension of decolonization within the region, it has no small part to do with not only the rehabilitation of Japan along rightist, markedly anti-communist lines, but also the rehabilitation throughout the region of figures. You can think of the Philippines, Korea, Indonesia, figures who collaborated with the Japanese. And, I'm thinking of Keith Camacho's incredible work too about collaboration, but there are these sorts of parallel histories too. The division of the Northern Marianas, from Guam, and then also with regard to Korea, the division, and then these kinds of overlapping imperial histories. And so one thing that I'm thinking about so much these days is how do we start to think in creative and generative ways about how US imperialism, its military imperialism within the region, relies upon the sub-imperial collusion of regional actors. You showed that slide of, when you're talking about Chamorro political leaders versus 100 people going into the office and saying, no, it's such a stark, it's stark evidence of the fact that something other than democracy is taking place in those settings, and that the people of the region are positioned as a collateral damage. And so even though there is this kind of collusive structure that US imperialism relies upon, it's precisely because US militarism is a network structure and it relies upon our participation in the oppression and destruction of others, that there's also a kind of reticulated basis for imagining solidarity.
Yes. Oh, yes. No, I definitely agree. And I think that one thing, when in responding to what you shared there, I think that one thing in terms of decolonization, because I mentioned that Guam can't participate in regional forums, can't actually formally connect to anyone around us. And so one of those first steps for me is really just gaining the ability to situate ourselves and think for ourselves and then move from there, right? Which is, and because, so stop sort of relying upon a history which feeds into the power of another, right? So stop sort of seeing our history and our place in the world in such a way where, I mean, it was very interesting because at the start of the conversation around the military buildup increases in Guam now, the movement of Marines from Okinawa to Guam, there was a former governor who, the governor of Okinawa at that time, wanted to come and visit Guam to speak to the governor and the people to talk about what they might expect because of the problems that Okinawa has had with the Marines. And it was one thing, this was very jarring for me because I was a grad student at that time. And the governor of the island rejected the invitation, saying he needed to get the permission of the State Department to talk to the governor. Basically saying, and for me, that really affected me because I was like, no, you should think for yourself. This is somebody who's trying to connect to you, as you were saying, and on a basis of that militarism connects us, but we can connect in our own ways. We don't have to be just the pieces on the chessboard. We can connect through resistance. And so the fact that the leaders in Guam at that time were so hesitant to talk to the Okinawans, it actually then led to activists sort of seeking those connections instead, because we wanted to know what the Okinawans had to say about this beyond sort of the discourse about China threats and Japan and the US sort of security, unity, and stuff like that. But I think there's so much potential. And part of it, at least from Guam, starts with sort of looking at where we are in the world and then just starting to think for ourselves, not sort of believe in sort of the propaganda, the press releases anymore.
Right. I'm sorry to just add one more thing. I know that there are other questions, but I wanted to just say that, insofar as the United States literally supplanted Japan throughout the larger Pacific region, throughout Asia in the wake of World War II, the sort of threat of Japan was supplanted by the United States. And it's really interesting to get a kind of dual view of this in the two Koreas. In North Korea and in South Korea, there is a common expression for the Japanese colonial period. It's ilche-shide. And in North Korea, there's an additional expression, niche-shide, and it means the Japanese imperial or colonial period, era. The one in North Korea, it refers to not just the Japanese imperial period, but the American one. And what's so interesting is if you say that very similar expression down in South Korea, people are like, what? Because it's not that there isn't activism, but it's almost like in popular language and discourse, the structure that surrounds can't even be named, It's that intense, the disavowal.
Great, thank you. And kind of like, this is I have like a viewer question. I know we're running short of time, but I have a viewer question, hopefully targeted towards like the three panelists. So how do we fight the deep anti-communist sentiment in the US Asian diaspora against China, as well as the commonly held idea that US imperialism against Asia and posturing against China won't affect them? How do we tie the increasing US aggression against China into our fates in the US? So Christine, I know you have previously in your book, A Violent Peace, you've written about this in the context of the post-war period in Japan, the usage of Japanese Americans as tools in the quote unquote reconstruction of Japan in the US's image. So, and I personally see these parallels with diaspora in the US as well, as who are essentially functioning as tools of like anti-communism. So I know you've written about this in Christine, but I want to extend this to the rest of the panel as well.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I would say is that when you're talking about Korean Americans as a community or a demographic that has been biopolitically produced through US gatekeeping policies, we have to acknowledge that those gatekeeping policies are anti-communist. And so the same kind of securitized sifting and sorting of populations. You know, for example, we can think of Miami Cubans, the most notorious. You know, we can also think about Vietnamese refugee communities, you know, the first generation in particular. And then you think about Korean Americans, there was a concerted effort on the part of the national security state to securitize these populations by determining their loyalty, you know, their anti-communism. But one thing that I would say, and this is what the scholar Lisa Lowe says, she says that US wars in Asia, which actually displaced so many Asians who ended up oftentimes immigrating or relocating to the United States, that they have a kind of memory of that ruin. And oftentimes, because of the kind of intense anti-communism, not only of the starting point, like if you think of a place like South Korea, you know, but also the destination, the United States, there's a silencing of any kind of dissent. If I were to speak about anti-communism today, we have to also think about the other kinds of rhetorical forms it takes. And one of them is professed concern about human rights. And so a kind of interventionist human rights rhetoric is basically anti-communism by another name. You know, in the North Korean instance, figures that have relocated and are now part of the Korean diaspora in the United States include celebrity defectors who are viewed by the United States as more legitimate representatives of North Korea than North Koreans themselves. And so these kinds of figures are part of hawkish policy circles, and they've played a key role. It's also the case that within the Korean American community, there are evangelical, you know, generations of evangelical Korean Americans who have a kind of ancestral memory of North Korea as a place where their landlord ancestors had property. And so not only do they have an irredentist vision toward North Korea that they want to restore to its status as the land of the gospel, you know, during the sort of missionary heyday, but also they have supposed land claims on North Korea. And they've aligned themselves with thinly renovated Cold Warriors under the rubric of North Korean human rights, pushing for intervention by hard and soft means, totally disregarding any kind of humanitarian sort of politics in the name of, you know, very hard solutions toward North Korea. But it's also the case, and we can't forget this, that there's a long legacy of anti-imperialist critique, and this goes back within, you know, it goes back to even before the sort of late 60s moment of third worldist consciousness. We can think about even in the 1950s, there were Korean diasporic figures who were brought up before HUAC, you know, and they were aligned with Black radicals like Paul Robeson. And so this is something that I explore in my research. But yeah, sorry about the long-winded answer. I know that we're close to out of time.
Or for me, I think I think that so last year was sort of a moment where a lot of conversations around racial justice reached the mainstream in the United States, burst into the streets, literally. And so one thing that'll be very important is, what is the role of empire in that conversation? Is it a conversation which is just domestic, right? And then sort of which neutralizes and limits any extension of those critiques extending out into the territories or extending out into the foreign policy sort of conversation, right? Because that'll be a big thing, is that if the United States is just going to sort of, but for me, I see that as an important moment, because if, for example, the territories, if there is some continued sort of conversation around that, and if the territories play a role in that, whether it's Puerto Rico or Guam, it will move into it will sort of start to get into the conversations around militarism which is one of those conversations that the United States cannot have. It just cannot have. But if it's married into something about racial justice and it extends out in that way, then you may get the starts of it. But that's one of those main things, is these are conversations which are purposefully pushed out and displaced into the territories and into other countries. But can you use the territories as a means to try to bring them in to the middle where the US has to reckon with them?
I'd just like to quickly chime on to that question, because I think the question of anti-communism in the diaspora is, particularly relevant for the Chinese diaspora and the Chinese American community. And I think, going off of both Michael and Christine's comments, I think that this issue really speaks to the way that a superficial kind of multiculturalism is really used as a weapon of US imperialism. And I think we're seeing that very tangibly and immediately in the context of US aggression on China. And, pushing back, I think, on the use of Chinese Americans or Chinese informants who, offer a quote unquote authentic take on China, which, coincidentally falls in line with the ambitions of the State Department. I think it requires, understanding that anti-communism in the diaspora is always structured by imperialism, by immigration policy, by ideological conditioning. And this is something that I think many of us can see in our own families. My family came to the United States from China via Taiwan in the 1960s. So I have also grown up with these narratives of quote unquote fleeing communism. And I think it takes honest historical inquiry to understand that our own family histories, our own migration trajectories, there's a class character to our family's experiences. There's geopolitical alliances and collaborations, which we potentially need to unpack and be honest about. And, I think there's a very dangerous tendency that I notice in Asian American cases where we take on this privileged platform of edifying our families or our communities back in our country's origin, which I think not only, fosters an anti-communist and imperialist agenda, but also, just really embraces and reifies a notion of that because we've been exposed to American education, to liberalism, to capitalism, that we have, a superior and objective worldview. And I think that's really dangerous, and that going against that will require centering voices, for instance, of Chinese people and Chinese people in the diaspora that don't neatly align with common narratives that we are allowed to be exposed to.
Great, thank you so much. So unfortunately, we are out of time. Again, I'm repeating myself at this point, but this has been a really fantastic, really informative, very educational panel. Like to give a virtual round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much. So maybe just a very last word. So I'm with Qiao Collective. You can find us on social medias, on major social media platforms at Qiao Collective, Qiao Collective, no spaces. If the panelists would like to share maybe the organizations that they're connected with or how to reach them, feel free to do so.
I am with an organization called the Korea Policy Institute. It's kpolicy.org, and it's a grassroots public educational institute that has linkages to organizations, peace and social justice organizations on the ground in South Korea.
You can follow Independent Guahan on social media. That's a great place to sort of get updates. You can also follow the Fanatsu podcast on social media too, which is a decolonization focused podcast from Guam.
And I am currently organizationally unaffiliated, but if you want to reach out or stay in touch, my Twitter is just my last name at @SimPutterman. And my email address is also just simputterman@brown.edu. So.
Thank you so much. With that, I'd like to wrap up, and for those of you observing, have a happy Lunar New Year. For the rest of us, for the rest of you, enjoy the rest of your week, enjoy your weekend, and thank you to the People's Forum for hosting this for us.